Friends, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this collaborative effort of the IIC and WISCOMP to generate debates and dialogues on engendering nuclear disarmament. Now, there are two ways in which engendering can be read, and we are all familiar with that. And just so there is the N with a dash, gendering, and there is engendering. And so this is the 60th anniversary celebrations at the center, and we are privileged to have with us distinguished senior diplomats, scholars, and many practitioners who are going to join us. And I'm particularly delighted that of the overwhelming majority of people who signed up to come and registered are young scholars and hopefully young people who want to make their way into this field, which is a daunting field. It has been a daunting field, especially for women. And we are delighted that the sessions will be kick-started, as they say, or rolled up or scaled up by the presence of Ambassador Lakshmi Puri and Jayant Prasad, who will do the inaugural addresses today with us. But I did want to say that the leitmotif of WISCOMP's engagement has always been bridging the gap between expertise and potential in a non-hierarchical engagement, bridging theory and praxis, academia, and the think tank space. So we look forward to a especially stimulating exchange. The larger provocation for today's conversation is, of course, the alarm bells that the war in Ukraine has set off, with the looming threat of Russia's vainglorious signaling a possible resort to nuclear arsenal. The more immediate context, however, is a work in progress, an edited volume by Professor Manpreet Sethi, who's here, and Kanika Rakra, to which several experts who will adorn this table have contributed. The tentative title to this, which I think WISCOMP has also indirectly contributed to, is Engendering Nuclear Disarmament. And it foregrounds the voices of women and provides a rich repertoire to expand and amplify their perspectives in this critical area. So this is also a deliberation, a conversation on the roads traversed, the roads not taken, the roads less traveled, and the roads still to be explored. Interesting, Willy Brandt, speaking at the IIC on North-South relations, peace and disarmament, way back in 1984, invoked the link between disarmament and development, referring then to the then heightened arms race between the USA and the USSR. And he spoke about MAD and somewhat presciently about the need to replace the concept of security of individual states by common security. And since he saw the then two superpowers not living up to their responsibilities under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, he advocated for a new disarmament initiative across 4 continents launched by the non-aligned countries. And then what is the third world today leading the brigade. He said since the two superpowers are too obsessed with their arsenals, it is important that other voices come and make their impact. He also said that this way it would contribute to reaching first a nuclear freeze and then negotiations about arms reduction. This is through such action, he said, of non-nuclear states that we can avoid the stalemate where negotiations are stuck at present. He was prescient, I think, about the TPNW. But then he saw India playing a major role leading this movement. But today, is nuclear disarmament a pipe dream? Is it a pie in the sky? What room still remains? What spaces can be pried open? I'm very acutely aware that many of the experts around the table do not believe that disarmament is possible, and which is why this dialogue is so important. After decades of arms control agreements, security cooperation, and a growing consensus about the unacceptability of nuclear weapons, the world is now headed in the opposite direction. Geopolitical tensions have heightened, new arms races have started, states have reverted to valorizing nuclear weapon. The nuclear taboo, which was a concept that was arrived at with so much negotiation, is weakening, but nothing about this was inevitable. It is a choice our leaders have made. Nuclear disarmament will have to be a long-term project. Today's decision makers may not be able to complete the task, but they have an obligation to pursue it. Some of us in the room will hark back to the halcyon days when India was the international norm raiser, the flag bearer on disarmament. Manpreet's paper and the thrust of her book is entirely on this issue. And it was the moral conscience against WMDs, the voice of sanity holding aloft the vision of complete disarmament. But that was a different time. The world has changed dramatically since then, we are reminded, and I think Jayant will remind us of that. And strategic geopolitical consideration demand the sobriety of realism, some say. Our own screens today seldom call up the fact that the issue of banning atomic weapons became one of the first tasks of the UN, the early ban the bomb debates, and that Prime Minister Nehru was one of the first statesmen to draw attention to the need to suspend all nuclear weapons, citing the devastation of the infamous Bravo project in the Marshall Islands, which had wrought so much devastation and prompted the proposal antecedents, and this is interesting, of the NPT and CTPT. Also the Russell-Einstein appeal of '55 that had a profound influence in mobilizing global public opinion and peace movements. We have a couple of activists from the peace movements with us here today, and it's important to open the spaces for dialogue between these two communities, the security establishment and the peace movements, which at the moment are running almost parallel to one another. So our principled positions on the NPT and CTBT, especially in the Conference of Disarmament, interrogated the coloniality of the discourse, calling out the gross discrimination that was embedded in its framing, thereby according legitimacy and unequal power to some states over others. That is, impunity for some and accountability and responsibility to others, thereby skewing the notion of state sovereignty itself. India's formal policy of support, as this August gathering knows, for nuclear disarmament long predates its own development of nuclear weapons. Also, later, the Rajiv Gandhi proposal for nuclear disarmament, which was a plan of 1988, remained for a long time the touchstone of India's formal disarmament policy. Today, our position on TPNW is a stark reminder that much water has flown down the Ganga, especially after India ended her nuclear ambiguity after testing in May 1988, and when the Buddha ironically smiled. For many of us in this non-policy space in civil society, abiding questions remain whether there is a concerted effort to completely reverse India's principled stand over the years to advance the cause of global nuclear disarmament. Then, of course, there are the familiar questions that this group knows only too well from civil society, the peace constituency and the anti-nuclear groups within India. Does our no first use policy of the doctrine somehow humanize India's doctrine of credible minimum deterrence, which is, as you all know, assured retaliation to inflict unacceptable damage in a retaliatory strike or strikes? And does that, in a sense, determine our nuclear posture? Is it the case that, contrary to the stated goal of increasing India's security, the security environment around India today stands seriously degraded? Not just the specter of China's unfriendly rise, but the horrors that Ukraine today bring up on our screens, the dangers around Zaporizhia, Europe's largest nuclear plant, caught in Russia's Ukraine war. Today, experts talk of revisiting no first use in India. And there have been many editorials and articles about revisiting that particular doctrine. So the apparent paradox, not just the conundrum of India as a NWS advocating a nuclear weapons-free world, is not lost on us, but is explained by India's unique strategic situation, being situated in the most heavily nuclearized neighborhood in the world between two hostile nuclear neighbors and the complicities between them, where non-state actors are also powerful, where rapidly changing technologies impact the use, deployment, and proliferation of weapons in dangerously innovative and unexpected ways. There are new mind-boggling technologies being added to state arsenal. Is cap, seize, and roll back even a possibility today? Planning to survive first strike or a decision to go in for a triad, of which we have very many distinguished gentlemen from the armed forces present here, going in for a triad of delivery systems, the logic of an Arihant, nuclear-powered ballistic missiles, SSBNs and SLBMs. So where does that lead us in terms of the larger discourse on nuclear disarmament? I think Shiv Shankar Menon described this very, shall I say, succinctly, and I quote him. He says, nuclear decision making in India is an example of strategically bold decisions combined with tactically cautious steps, a pattern that is not uniquely Indian, but one that Indian foreign policy and security policy has made its own, end quote. I have seldom found a more masterful articulation of diplomaties. But what is of concern is that there is a growing consensus today within India, and which is replacing the old consensus against nuclearization and for total disarmament. And this is not just true of India. Globally, there seems to be a recrudescence of cultures of militarism and the legitimization for weaponization, which is why the discourse around the TPNW becomes so crucial. It's important to keep the alternative discourses alive and bring other voices, right now muffled, to the table. And here civil society actors, small non-nuclear states, many of whom you have represented, Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, the global south mobilized to voice their concern through the TPNW that came into force in early 2021. The experts present here are so familiar with the genuflections and deadlocks around the CTBT and FMCT debates and the lexical maneuverings around the use versus test interpretation in the text of the CTBT in the CD that Ambassador Sujata Mehta, who's going to join us later, so evocatively described as a body whose epitaph is written each day whenever the issue of disarmament is broached. So the value of the moral imperatives still continues even as people question the continuation of the CD itself. It's also interesting to trace how we finessed our language, fine-tuned our lexical deployment of semantics to reflect our changing emphases at different points in our own nuclear disarmament trajectory. And it's revealing in the statements of three women ambassadors who represented us at CD, Arundhati Ghosh, Savitri Kunadi, and of course Sujata Mehta. Sujata is not here. And I went through their different statements and how each time, before the test, after the test, and then before the Indo-US nuclear deal, and after the deal, how the statements had shifted very, shall I say, deftly the emphasis of the Indian position. I can share that with you, but it will take us into the next hour, and I have not been given time by Seema to do so. And we know that since the beginning of our century, the brief shining moment offered by Obama's Prague Spring and his commitment to the world without nuclear weapons and his step-by-step agenda were shattered against the reefs of congressional concerns and Pentagon intransigence, mired in Cold War mindsets. Even the earlier assertions and validatory statements of the powerful Four Horsemen or the quartet of Kissinger, Perry, Sam, and Nunn that broke with the idea that complete disarmament was a distant, impractical goal and asserted that working to global zero was in US interest. Even that could not save the day. And we all, of course, are aware that US, China, and Russia are leading the way in massive modernization processes, developing new delivery systems, including in China, what they call missile tipped with multiple warheads, creating incentive for other side to strike so that the first knock can be there, the knockdown can be theirs. But have we also done away completely with the nuclear taboo discourse? These and other issues will certainly be debated. And where is global zero at all in our discussions today? Is it even now an impossible pipe dream? But so coming back really to the burden of my song, and I don't think I have much time, and which is engendering disarmament and women, disarmament and women's voices. I just thought I will share a story with you, which was shared by Carol Cohn in an article titled "War, Wimps and Women." And she recounted an incident told to her by a male physicist who, Carol Cohn, as you know, has worked for several years on nuclear issues and national security at Harvard University. And I quote the story. She said, "Several colleagues and I were working on modeling counterforce attacks, trying to get realistic estimates of the number of immediate fatalities that would result from different deployments. At one point, we remodeled a particular attack using slightly different assumptions." And of course, Marshal Patni would know that only too well, and found that instead of there being 36 million immediate fatalities, there would be only 30 million. And everybody was sitting around the room saying, nodding and saying, "Oh yeah, that's great, only 30 million. When all of a sudden I heard what we were saying, and I blurted out, "Wait, I've just heard how we are talking. Only 30 million? Only 30 million human beings killed instantly?" Silence fell upon the room. Nobody said a word. They didn't even look at me. It was awful. I felt like a woman. But thanks to the mandates of the landmark UNSCR resolution 1325 in 2000, large numbers of women have entered the peace and security space. The SDGs further melted the divide between the so-called soft issue areas of development, inhabited mostly by women, and NGOs, and the hard issue areas of security, inhabited by men, mostly in black suits. Despite this progress, the fields of multilateral arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament, with the notable exception of small arms and light weapons, have remained relatively removed from the gender right-streaming impetus. A 2019 study, which is quoted in our background note by the UNIDR, found that gender inequality persists in disarmament diplomacy, with women comprising only 32% participants in disarmament-related meetings over the past 43 years. In some smaller official fora, the members dropped to 20%. And this is usually in the first committee, whereas in the third committee, there is a overwhelming presence of women. So there exists, even within the official UN disarmament community, identified hierarchies, with fields such as nuclear posture and deterrence being more insulated and male-dominated and unwelcoming compared to non-proliferation arena or the non-governmental advocacy sector, which are perceived to be more open to including women. So the issue of nuclear weapons has largely been formally left out, even within the WPS agenda discursive fields so far, though there is potential to discuss nuclear weapons through the WPS prevention and participation pillars. And we are aware of the efforts of champions like Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, who is here, in her role both as Assistant Secretary General at the UN and former Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, who have consistently pushed the envelope on this issue. So women's voices for disarmament, especially through civil society activism, is as old as Lysistrata in Greece and Athens, where she asked for a sexual strike in order to get the men of Athens and Sparta to make peace. But that was many years ago. But now, in the context of nuclear resistance, we have the Greenham Commons women, we have the Liberian Women's Initiative, we have the Women Nobel Laureates Forum, and of course the iconic parent body of women's anti-war movements, the WILF, the women in peace and freedom, international peace and freedom. Even women protesters in India at Balyapal and Kudakulam, among others, and Meera Shiva is here, who's participated very, very intensely in many of these movements. We also know of the Chagai Hills resistance movement. But the first time, really the first time, the General Assembly formally addressed the vital link between women and disarmament following from 1325 to ensure increased representation of women at all decision-making levels in national, regional and international institutions was in September 2010, when the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Kamla Persad Bissessar, announced that her government would introduce a resolution on women disarmament, arms control and non-proliferation to the General Assembly. That was the landmark GA Resolution 6569. And from there was no looking back. In many ways, it did set the stage for a TPNW-like initiative, which, as you know, featured a large number of women delegates and spokespersons and interlocutors. And the recent humanitarian initiative and the TPNW have highlighted the gendered effects of nuclear weapons along with ionized radiation and reproductive health, especially for women, psychological stigma, especially among those who were victims of the Nagasaki and Hiroshima nuclear incident. So the negotiations around the TPNW which came into force, as you all know, in January 21, is the first international treaty to acknowledge in its texts the gendered nature of the impact of nuclear weapons and mandates gender-sensitive remediation provisions for nuclear harm. It was path-breaking, in also challenging the dominant narrative about nuclear weapons. The negotiations of the treaty featured several female leaders. Some of the most active delegations were led by women, including Ireland, New Zealand, the Philippines, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, and so on. The list is long, and it was headed by Elena Gomez of Costa Rica, who was the negotiating president. And there was the presence of civil society groups and women engaged in peace processes, along with, of course, WILP that was anchoring the whole process. Today, women's participation has been foregrounded by several initiatives to optimize support and enable women's effective engagement in the nuclear policy space. To mention a few, there is, of course, ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the two arms control subgroups of gender champions at Geneva and also in Washington, D.C., the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium Initiative, and in addition, the British American Society Information Council, BASIC, Chatham House, and Center for Feminist Foreign Policy have developed a gender think tank and international affairs toolkit. Many of the contributors to this volume are part of the BASIC network, and it has been a pleasure to hear them there. But it's significant that nothing of this scale, support, and commitment is available to women in our region. And the few women who are active in the disarmament space are present here, and you can literally count them on your fingertips. In fact, the BASIC initiative, along with the University of Birmingham, in partnership with two adjunct initiatives, APNAP and SCRAP, which is Strategic Concept for the Removal of Arms and Proliferation, is actively engaged in revisiting and redefining the terms of reference in the nuclear discourse itself. A new way of thinking and talking about nuclear weapons, and it flips the discourse away from nuclear responsible states to nuclear responsibilities, which is a significant, not just a semantic, but it is a significant conceptual shift in the ways in which to look at disarmament. And underlying that is the assumption that disarmament and nuclear weapons are everybody's business, not just the nuclear weapon state. And everyone has a role to play, not just those who own the weapons, but those whose security is likely to be impacted by them, smaller states, small island states, and the whole plethora of people whose lives are impacted by the decisions that are made elsewhere. I'm getting very rude looks from my colleague, but basically, I just want to add that in the reified language of techno-strategic discourse, it is often it is often said that women don't know enough about the strike capacity of missiles. They need to educate themselves better. And so this becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of keeping them completely out of the discourse itself. The few that do manage to make their way in are subjected to several rites of passage. It's called the straitjacketing of conceptual space. And that is something that is another aspect that inhibits articulate women from articulating effectively enough in these fora. So, in fact, we must become vigilant also that we need not put too much emphasis on the notion just of inclusion. It's not numeric representation that we're looking for. It's not the size of the table, it's the shape of the table and what is brought to the table. It is not just how many women or who says what, but what is said and how what is said is actually understood, received, and put into practice. As Audre Lorde, the famous American author, said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So, in this field, our silence will only destroy us, which is why women's role in processes, especially of verification, is crucial, and also building accountability. End of the day, these weapons constitute a form of violence, not only against one species, but against the planet itself. And we really have to make sure that we push back against unconscious bias. It is not that men don't want us in the room. It is just that both men and women are not conscious of bias. We really must together work towards resisting manuals where only men in black suits speak, and make it a point, if we are committed to disarmament, to not join those panels if there are no women present, bringing a different perspective, and not just women, but diversity of all sorts. So I would just close by saying what we want is not to just use the WPS notion of inclusion in terms of more women at the table, but what is brought to the table. It's not just women speaking for women, but it's women and men speaking for humanity, that the WPS agenda, and I know Lakshmi has been in the forefront of that, addressing at every possible, shall I say, venue, at every possible forum that is looking at what is known as security. I don't have to push the point that human security is often lost in the discourses, the high table discourses against of national security. And the heat and dust of subaltern aspirations never enters really the room. So I will conclude with just one particular sort of comment, and that is drawn from a very, shall I say, sensitive nuclear non-proliferationist, or shall I say, a conflict resolutionary, and Renata Dwan. And she has rightly pointed out that gender right streaming is about a transformative agenda that seeks to influence not just who speaks, but the substance and tools of arms control and beyond. It is not just an issue for or by women, but a much broader reorientation agenda. As the community grapples with security implications of dual-use technologies and how to regulate its intangible algorithms, exploring new ways of framing, the issue is what must be done. End quote. So engendering must go beyond numbers to encompass the assumptions and ways in which the world defines, makes, and implements control over weapons. It means asking who controls the weapons, who is affected by it. It means looking at ways in which security, power, authority, and accountability are defined. And therefore, there is a lot of work to do, and I'm glad that this particular gathering or group will set off several conversations in reinforcing and engendering disarmament. So, and I'm delighted that we have two very eminent speakers. The keynote will be delivered by Ambassador Jayant Prasad, who you all know is the former ambassador of India to the UN Conference on Disarmament and member of the UN Security General's Advisory Board on Disarmament. If anyone knows disarmament, it is Jayant and Shilkant Sharma, who will hopefully join us at some point. He served, of course, as he was one of India's most popular ambassadors to Nepal. I can vouch for that because I've heard it from so many of my friends. He was ambassador to Algeria. He was also at the Development Cooperation Indian mission to the European Union at Brussels. He served as Special Secretary Public Diplomacy. He was Rapporteur of the UN Commission on Human Rights, Fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard, visiting scholar at the Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He was Director General of Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. But above all, he served as a lecturer in history at St. Stephen's College. And he's been a very dear friend and supporter of WISCOMP. I'll also take this opportunity to introduce Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, whom you all know very well. It's very difficult to listen to Ambassador Puri because most of the time we have to make up our minds whether to look at her or listen to her and to see which one is easier to do. So Ambassador Lakshmi Puri is a former Assistant Secretary General UN and Deputy Director Executive Director at the UN Women, and you know that transition between UNIFEM and UN was a very, very difficult transition, and the UN Women got itself space and got itself funds which were very, very frugal at that time. And I think Lakshmi played a key role in pushing the agenda for UN Women. She has served as India's ambassador to Hungary and also concurrently, interestingly, credited to Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that's where the whole discussion around 1325 in terms of what happened in Bosnia to the women there really received a fillip. Am I right, Lakshmi? And I know you played a very active role there as well. She was active in negotiating India's bilateral and multilateral economic diplomacy initiatives, and it goes on. It's the Bay of BIMSET, Indian Ocean Rim, you name it, the whole regional multilateral initiatives. And she was director of the United Nations Office of the High Representative for the Least Developed Countries and Landlocked Countries. She's of course received several awards, including the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights, the Novus Award for championing the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Millennium Campus Award, among others. But her most, I would say, most valuable credential, as far as we are concerned, was she was one of the brightest students of Lady Shri Ram College. So may I request Ambassador Prasad to address us, and if you would like to take the podium, sir, that's fine, or if you prefer to sit, that's fine too, whichever you prefer. The podium is on the other side, your podium, but if you prefer to sit, that's great too, whatever works for you.
I'll sit here.
Yeah. I apologize for the time I took, but we'll somehow try and make it up.